Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am hoping that we are live on our YouTube channel. We have a little light on my Zoom call this afternoon, which says we're live. So I'm hoping that we are. And a very warm welcome to the weekly Minister's Muse. If this is your first time with us, I hope you enjoy the conversation that's about to unfold. This is my weekly look at the scripture passages that are coming up on Sunday. So here at All Saints, we follow something called the Revised Common Lectionary, which is a pattern and structure of Bible readings shared with Anglicans around the world. Lutheran Church, Methodist Church uses it, and so on, and generally has a lot in common with the Roman Catholic Lectionary. So each week there are readings to look at, and I meet with different ministers to have a chat about it. If you are watching this live, do check in the comments, let us know you're here, and please join in with the conversation. I'm delighted that Sue Wallace is here. Hello, Sue. Do please keep joining with the conversation as we share together about the scriptures. What might they be saying to us? And if we're preaching on Sunday, where might we take a sermon? So while I put into the comments the readings that we're looking at today, I'm going to flick to gallery view and reveal to you my wonderful guests, who are going to press the unmute button and introduce themselves to you. So take it away. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alison. It's nice to be back with you again for this a couple of times now. I live over in East Leicestershire in some tiny rural villages where it is glorious and sunny today and beautiful. And since I was last with you, my youngest son decided to teach me to play the piano. I'm doing exceptionally badly, it has to be said, but I am trying hard. So that's my latest lockdown attempt to learn something new, which is tricky, but it is quite good fun nevertheless.
I'm Helen. It's my first rodeo on this, so to speak. I live in Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire, and I believe I'm the only non-Anglican amongst us today. Unless there's some in the comments, if you're not an Anglican, do say hi, make me feel, like I've got company. So I belong to a vineyard church in Melton, and I'm on the preaching team of Melton Vineyard Church. And interesting facts, I don't live a particularly interesting life. You join me in my bedroom, which is very familiar for our relationship, but I do spend a lot of time in my bedroom. I live with a chronic health condition. I spend a lot of time in bed, so that's where we are today. If you were trying to work out my background, no bookcases to ogle over, just my purple bedroom wall. That's me.
And then that's me. Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm the vicar of a large urban parish church in Huddersfield in West Yorkshire. I am just about as Yorkshire as it gets. I have moved around from church to church, but the whole distance between Halifax and Huddersfield isn't really that far. Now, what interesting fact can I tell you about me? I grew up in the church, but girls weren't allowed to do a lot of things when I was young. So I spent my time doing parish panto. And in my last church, a lady once said to me, "You are more cabaret than choir, Rachel, and I would like that on my gravestone." So that's what you need to know about me today. That, and I've just had a battery warning on my device. So I'm going to lean over and get my power cable, but I'm not going anywhere, okay?
Thank you. I think that's possibly the best introduction we've had so far, more cabaret than choir.
Oh, yeah.
I also would just like to note the fact, rather wonderfully, this is my first all-women lineup, which again has slightly happened by accident. I've been reaching out to all sorts of people to come and join with me and muse with me from different church backgrounds and perspectives, but it's great to have these wonderful women of God, preachers in their own right and leaders in the church to share with me today. And while you've been saying hello, Rachel's joined us again. Rachel's a regular here, and Chris Taylor, hello, excellent. So look forward to you joining in with the conversation. So let's dive in to the scripture passages. We always start with the gospel reading and then work our way through the other readings. And this week we continue, as we are in Matthew's gospel, we continue the horticultural theme. So last Sunday was the parable of the sower. This Sunday we have the parable of the weeds, which actually has a lot in common with my sermon from Sunday. And we've got weeds and the wheat growing together. And it sets up a series of parables in Matthew's Gospel where Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like this. Possibly not the most user-friendly of the parables. And we have that glorious phrase, which is a nightmare in Matthew's Gospel: there was much weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew's a bit of a miserable gospel for the weeping and gnashing of teeth. Alison, I think you were going to kick us off on this.
Yeah, this is really interesting for me. It's one of those when you kind of think, oh goodness, I recognise myself in this. So what was fascinating when it just jumped out at me when I was looking at this again is this, you get the wheat and the weeds, and the slaves of the householders say, oh, do you want us to sort it out? Do you want us to pull up the weeds and make it all neat and tidy? I was like, that's me, honestly. Can we just tidy it? Can we just make sure it's like, get it in order? I can have it straight in my head. I'm okay. And this just kind of reminded me, I think particularly at this moment in time, stuff's messy. And actually God in the messiness, it is kind of quite important. And I continually find myself having to kind of learn to live with the messiness. And not try and tidy it all up. And interestingly, I was in school, I haven't been able to go in very much, but I managed to, at a social distance with just me, go in and do one last question time with year 6. And one of the questions they asked was they'd been doing the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So no difficult questions about how we raise people from the dead, just if Jesus knew it was going to happen, why didn't he go and sort it out? Why did he wait? And we talked a bit about the messiness of things happening and learning through messiness. And it reminded me again of that conversation when I came to this passage.
So you have an urge to have tidy shrubbery in the garden. Is that
it's not gardening, I have to say. A garden does look much more like this. But in other things in life, the kitchen needs to be tidy. Oh, no, you can see the back of my office.
Well, to see your office, Alison. I'm not...
If I could say that my desire for tidiness is, you can see that it doesn't always work. So this is part of my learning to live in the messiness because it's good for me, even though my desire would be to have it all in order.
I think I might pinch that. While you've been talking, Rachel's chipped in to say this parable details the weirdest act of vandalism ever. You're quite right, Rachel. I'm going to go out and I'm going to spread some weed seed. That doesn't sound quite right either, does it really? In someone's agricultural plot. Helen, Rachel, does this grab you as a parable?
I think what Alison was saying really resonated with me about the messiness of life. When I was reading this parable again, the word I was reminded of is a word that's used by the author Glennon Doyle, who talks about life being brutiful, about the beautiful nature of life, but the brutal nature of life as well, and about just it speaks to the human condition really, about how we flourish amongst the weeds. It talks about how God's desire is always for us to flourish where we are. He plants us, and one of the verses, I can't remember offhand which one it is, but the question is, were these not good seeds that you planted? And actually, yes, God plants good seeds, and that is in contrast to some messages we hear in some churches, which is like we're all miserable sinners. Actually, no, God created, if you think about the creation narrative, he saw what he created, it was good. We are good seeds, essentially, but we live amongst the weeds. And God's desire is always for us to flourish where we are, but our calling is very much to flourish amongst the weeds. Obviously it speaks into that eschatological hope, which is not a word any preacher will be using on Sunday.
I don't know.
But we hope, I don't know, depends what your congregation is like. But yeah, it speaks to that future hope, but that present reality. And we have a phrase we use a lot in the vineyard, but it's not, it's not a vineyard phrase. It's everybody can have it, but we talk about, the now and the not yet of the kingdom. That is, that is very, go to any vineyard church, that is spoken about a lot. And that parable just speaks into that reality, doesn't it, really? Yeah.
The now and the not yet.
I've
not come across brutiful as a phrase. I quite like that. Yeah. Rachel, does that resonate with you, or would you go in a different direction?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, this gospel passage it sort of almost embodies the stuff that I ran away from about Christianity, when this seems to speak of judgment, and I don't like that. I want my Disney Jesus. I want, you know, with the little birdies on his fingers, and love for everybody. And this is another level. It reminded me of some of the conversations I had with clergy last week about the parable of the sower, and actually people who are interpreting that as being about God's generosity. And there is something about the generosity of the God who doesn't say, I am pulling that weed up now. Keep that weed away from my beautiful plants. Now, apparently, you know, if you get into the words of it, they probably look just about the same anyway. And then I start asking, am I the wheat or am I the weed? But there is something about God's generosity in kind of equal opportunities flourishing. You're going to have the same opportunities as the good seed. And there's something about God not closing that down right now, which is quite wonderful, I think.
Because I guess there is that danger that we go into a judgmental place, don't we? You know, about the weeds, and we want our churches to be tidy, holy people. You know, it kind of, yeah, who's in and who's out, that can play into our desire for order. I mean, I sometimes wonder the whole thing about judgment. I think, yeah, like you, Rachel, that's not the Jesus I want. I want the Jesus who says it's all okay, But then I kind of think life is messy, and like you touched on, Helen, life is brutal. And if I was on the receiving end of a brutal regime, you know, I guess, you know, if you think of Jesus speaking to people, you know, living under occupation, is there comfort actually in knowing that, you know what, this is going to be messy while you're doing this life, and actually you may be on the receiving end of real injustice. You may not be lifted out of poverty, actually. But actually there is a reckoning, and the injustices of this world will be held to account. So yeah, maybe there is comfort for some in knowing that there is that time when the weeds will be known for what they are.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. There was another interesting thing I read about you know, that bit where it talks about gathering the weeds first and burning them. That they would have been, at the time, the weeds would have been used as fuel, so on a fire, so gather them first and burn them. So actually they have a use when they're left. And then I haven't thought that through fully, but it just seemed interesting to me, that actually the things that look like they're of no use, you know, weeds, actually when left and then gathered can be used for fuel, which I just thought was
an interesting line of thought, isn't it?
I wanted to kind of followed it through, I have to say, but
I just want to bring in, there's some lots of quotes commenting going on from those who are with us today. So Chris says, questions about who's the creator of people. If God is the creator of people, then they are good. Bang on, Helen. There you go. Are the weeds people or distractions like the thorns that sprang up last week? Yeah. Is there a danger of personifying the wheat and the weeds, or is this more the circumstances that we're in? Rachel says, I find the idea of if you pull up the weeds, then you may also accidentally pull up potential crop quite striking. But that's also in the parable, isn't it? I wonder how much damage we do sometimes in our desire to purify things, or, you know, sift things, sort them out. Sue says, she was researching this for the Sanctum conference, and discovered that the Greek name for these weeds is a plant called darnel. Thank you very much, Sue. Yes, and I think it does, doesn't it look? It looks a lot like the wheat, I think. I think that's what the scholars tell us. Yeah. Chris says, God is love, so this may be a parable about do not judge. God has that. So this looks maybe like an inclusive parable that says all of us are alike and we cannot know who's in and who's out. Yeah. Oh, and sorry, Sue's come back in. The thing about darnel is it looks exactly the same as wheat until it is mature. I'll bring some more comments in a minute, but Rachel or Helen, do you want to respond to any of that? Or?
I think just touching on that difficulty with the whole judgment picture, I think it's a reminder about who does the judging, isn't it? Because it's God's job to deal with the weeds. It's not ours. You know, and I think you've touched on, I think, Rachel, and one of those comments about the similarities, you know, who are we to say which is which, you know, and when we get into that you're in, you're out business, and a lot of the parables deal with who's in and who's out, and it's always surprising to see who's in, you know, if you're one of the religious leaders at the time. So that's helpful. It also, I think, raises a bit of a question about to what extent is it our job to, you know, bring God's kingdom in now? We're talking about this in kingdom terms, aren't we? And we pray your kingdom come. What is our role in pulling up those weeds? If that is all the injustices and the things that prevent people from flourishing, I guess there's a challenge there, isn't there, about whose job is it? Whose plan is it? And just a reminder that actually we are to partner in God's plan, not ours. So to kind of, again, not to start, you know, gung-ho pulling up all the weeds, and actually to stop and go, actually, God, what is your plan in this? And we're partnering with you. It's bringing your kingdom in, not our, you know, landscaping ideas. So there's something in that, isn't there, about the kingdom and our role in bringing God's kingdom in now, in the now bit of the now and not yet.
Yeah. Rachel, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, my thinking was going with what Helen just said about whose job is the judgment. And actually, the older I get, the more comfortable, the more liberated I feel by the idea that belongs to God. Thank God that is not my job. Thank goodness that responsibility is not on my shoulders. And the more of the world's messiness I see and live with, the more grateful I am that I can say, yeah, that God will deal with that. And God's just left me here to just keep dealing with these little things here, and that's okay. So
things that you can take off of your responsibility list.
Yes, indeed. We are set free.
Alison,
going back to that comment, I can't remember who you said made it about the personifying the kind of weeds and the things. I think our temptation to do that probably comes from that second bit, because our lectionary reading, we miss out some verses. So the kind of second chunk of that has in it the kind of explanation bit, where Jesus starts to talk to his friends, and talks about the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, the field is the world, the good seed are the children of the kingdom, and the weeds are the children of the evil one. So I kind of, that's how I was then wrestling with, like, well, does that mean that that's a personification and therefore they are talking about people? But actually, it could be read like that. But I guess it could also be that, you know, that actually children of the kingdom, children of the evil one could equally be the things we do, we think, we say, in terms of that which comes from us, rather than being actual people. Because I was looking for the end to see whether it then talked about the children shining, but it doesn't. It says the righteous will shine like the sun. So it's a different, my Greek's not good enough, I'm afraid. I have no, so if someone else knows what the Greek is and whether it's the same things, but I'm assuming that as we've translated children and then righteous, it's a different word.
Yeah, because I suppose you could, rather than you could think about it all being me, couldn't you? I don't mean me personally, I mean individual. So I exhibit both the wheat and the weeds. I'm capable of all of that in any given hour, really, quite frankly, depending on what else is going on in this house. You know, and actually, you could work with it that way, couldn't you, a little bit, I think. And this idea that this is a parable about the kingdom. So is this is telling it how it is, again, which maybe is, Helen, is your thing, the now and not yet. The kingdom is, this is what it looks like. It has signs of growth and it has signs of, you know, stuff that isn't working. I want to bring in a few other people, well, the same people who were just contributing to the conversation, doing a great job here. Sue says I both love and am daunted by the fact that we can't tell the good from the bad. Rachel says also we can't be sure we aren't someone's weed. Bit humbling. Yeah, it is. I want to say little weed. That was the flower pot then, wasn't it, really? Sue says, yeah, I'm only half grown. I think I look like wheat. Chris says, I don't want to know who's in, who's out. Does God really have a naughty step? It's not quite weeping and gnashing of teeth, Chris, is it really, the naughty step? Is it our job or God's job to bring in the kingdom? And Sue says, not our landscape ideas. I love the idea. I think that was you, Helen, with your landscaping. Yeah. Anything else on this parable that someone's going, oh, I want to say this about it? Or should we sidestep into, I think Romans is where we might go next, because I think, Helen, it was you who touched on eschatological hope. You raised the bar there, Helen. But yeah, the Romans passage. So again, we've been working our way slowly through Romans over the last few weeks of the lectionary. And this passage again carries on from last week. We have this lovely bit at the end of it, which is about hope. And if we hope what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. But it also contains this lovely part about through the Spirit we cry, Abba, Father, and us being adopted as children of God. There's loads in there. Helen, you were taken by that when you're going to kick us off.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there's loads in there, as there always is with Paul, and particularly Romans. You always sort of sharp intake of breath when you get to Romans, because you could do a sermon series on every single verse. There's so much here. Like you said, the first aspect you get to is this sonship and this crying Abba Father and this picture of this relationship. And I think in the context of all the judgment conversations we've been having, and you've got in the one hand the picture in Matthew of the gnashing of teeth and all of that business, and then the sonship that the prodigal son parable speaks to. So you can either focus on that aspect, can't you, the prodigal son and the forgiving father, and what sonship means, and you can explore that, or you can explore the judgment and the wrath and the hellfire and damnation. So pay your money, take your choice. But I think the thing that really jumped out to me isn't their sonship bit, actually. It's a bit further down, and it's about this wonderful verse about the whole of creation groaning. And you've got all of the stuff in there. I'm sure many of your churches were following the Saying Yes to Life, Ruth Valerio's book, about the liberation, this sort of the eschatological hope, that phrase, the end times, it's about it's not just personal salvation. This is not our individual salvation. This is about the whole of creation being liberated, actually, at those end times. And in the meantime, that messiness of life, where all of creation is groaning, and they're just as much part of this now and not yet of the kingdom business as we are, aren't they? And I think that the two passages tie in quite nicely with this picture of the end times and the what's happening meanwhile bit. And this just is such a powerful phrase, that whole of creation groaning. And as someone who has given birth 4 times, I can really relate to the picture of labor pains and the bringing forth of new life. And I get really excited about anything to do with that picture of bringing new life, because that's the exciting bit for me, that you've got the problem of the messiness, but you've also got the opportunities, haven't you, to meet that, and to sort of be midwives, spiritual midwives of this new life that's coming. So that's what really excited me about the Romans passage, off the back, particularly of the Matthew passage. Look at me tying the passages in. See, I've not forgotten the lectionary preaching altogether.
There's hope for you, yes. There's eschatological hope for our being your preacher. Rachel, what about you in this passage? Is that where you're drawn to it? Is it the sonship bit, the creation bit?
Do you know, I feel like I'm still working through my hang-ups with St. Paul. And I know I've read the stuff that says he didn't mean it like that. This is rhetoric. He's addressing his audience. But when I picked up the Bible to look at the readings for today, and it starts off with flesh and spirit, flesh stuff bad, spirit stuff good, I'm immediately defensive, and I have to think my way round that to get to that glorious image of birthing, which then reminds me that St. Paul didn't mean that, and it's okay. But it's just, I have to do that little bit of mental work quite often. I appreciate that the greater study would reward me on this, and that I wouldn't have to kind of work through those words every time they come up in Paul if I spent more time with it. But that's kind of where I start with it. And as much as the image of birthing, whenever Paul talks about the spirit of adoption, that the image and the imagery of adoption as being this creation of God's family. We are God's family by adoption, not by blood or right or inheritance. That is just huge for me, and a hugely powerful thing to preach to people who see themselves perhaps as outside what God's family appears to look like right here in your nice tidy church, where you've got rid of the weeds, but you can't tell. Right? Yeah, that image of adoption is huge for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting, in our last week's Muse, we were talking about that tension that's unhelpful, and particularly in Western thought as well, the separation of mind and heart, and kind of like, but actually that isn't how life is. It is holistic, and we'll allow you to wrestle with Paul. We all have to do that, don't we, really? But yeah, and also I think there's something as well, isn't there, when we know what happens when these scriptures are used unhelpfully, and how people can demonize their own bodies and have a really unhealthy relationship with themselves if you lift that out, and just and don't hear it with any of the context, or hear it in its wider stuff around this beautiful image. We are adopted children of God. Although I was going to say to you earlier, Helen, you were talking about the lovely bit of fatherhood and then the gnashing of teeth. I thought that was just parenting anyway, really. That, that's
Oh yes,
isn't it really? Alison, where would you? Are you not annoyed with Paul, or can you forgive him his splitting of spirit and flesh?
I don't like the splitting of spirit and flesh stuff. I think for exactly the reasons you were just talking about it. I think I've walked beside too many people whose idea of their own body has been affected by this idea that flesh is bad, and taken literally. I think that's incredibly unhelpful. But this idea of adoption, it strikes me every time I read this, the kind of where it follows through, children of God, etc., and then joint heirs with Christ. I still find that mind-blowing. That doesn't quite seem possible, and yet it's that kind of, for me, that kind of abundant generosity of grace that I still have to kind of read more than once to think, does that mean me too? Am I part of that? That is what it says. It's just so overwhelmingly generous. It's sometimes quite difficult to properly accept. I find it much easier to say it to other people, where it's kind of I don't find that difficult at all. But if I'm really honest with myself, whilst I believe it's about me in my head, there are days when I don't think that's necessarily as well internalized in my heart as I think it would do me more benefit if it was.
To be an heir with Christ. Yeah. Sue mentions that the idea in Roman times that important people adopted children, or even adult, she says, I'm pretty sure that's that's in there, isn't it? Would inherit everything. But I wonder as well, is there an element of responsibility with inheritance? So I mean, it does say that we're heirs with Christ if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may be glorified with him. I was going to say there's no such thing as a free lunch, but I suppose that is what grace is. So there is a free lunch, it's fine, because God does love us freely. But there's always just another slight thing that I don't know, if we are heirs with Christ, is that there's that expectation we're picking up our cross, we're following. So I don't know. Does it shape us? Is it that when we acknowledge that shapes the way we live? I don't know.
It kind of feels like it's that kind of relationship response stuff, to me, that kind of understanding how much God has done to reach out to me. My kind of only response is to love back. I find myself back with parenting again. Love is not always kind of fluffy and pleasant. Sometimes it can be really hard work. And sometimes it involves a bit of suffering and pain along the way. But the motivation of going through that, it is about love and relationship.
Yeah. Anyone else want to chip back in on this passage?
I almost feel quite frustrated with the lectionary for having this entire passage, because there's almost two massive themes here that could be explored, isn't there? So like I whizzed straight past all the sonship adoption stuff and went straight to creation groaning and labour pains, and so you've got a whole thing about creation there and labour pains and bringing new life, and you've got a whole thing about what adoption means. two massively powerful subjects and sermons in their own right. And I don't know, can you do them both justice? I don't know.
Well, you can just pick out one. Let's go on, Rachel. You're going to say something profound.
Wow, there was just something that I read earlier this morning, and the guy writing the commentary just said, Paul is ecstatic. You know, he's in the zone with this, and actually you feel it, and it's like, yes, and nature's groaning, and it's amazing, and yeah, that fullness of what he's saying, and it is almost too much. He's absolutely
like, and another thing, and yeah. While I'm here, and this, and this, and this, and this.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. That's not a 3-point sermon, Paul. Just reel it in.
But I wonder if that, if you were preaching this text particularly, some of that energy and enthusiasm you would want to bring, would you not? That this flows from, that. So maybe that's where, you would want to shape a sermon around that energy and passion, and, we are adopted children of God, there is a hope, and all those things. People have been joining in, as always, before we leave Paul for a few moments. Sue had said that creation liberated. For me, the Celtic cross is a reminder of that salvation, not just for us, but for the whole created order. Chris is tying this in a little bit with about the gospel passage, that maybe, so Paul last week was talking about minds that were set on the flesh, and is that where there's a connection between the weeds and the wheat? We can be distracted, can't we? Rachel says it's the redeeming of all created things of which we are a part, I guess, but I still find the dichotomy of flesh and spirit in Paul very hard. I reckon Paula Gooder could rescue that for us. She's normally my go-to to help me rescue Paul. Sue says, my head, perhaps translating a spirit. My head, perhaps translating a spirit and stuff in my head rather than spirit and flesh. Okay, that's an interesting take. Rachel says that spirit of slavery to fear imagery is so powerful. I love the song, No Longer a Slave to Fear, for I am a child of God, and what it means to step into that lack of fear. And I wonder again, we're always preaching in a context, and there's a lot of fear around right now, around all sorts of issues. Is it possible to give people a sermon that lifts them from that place of fear into a place of hope, a place of adoption? And Chris loves the inclusive phrase of groaning in labour pains, the divine feminine. Yeah, there's a whole sermon there to be preached as well, isn't there? And Rachel says to you, Helen, it's all right, Helen, it will come round again in a few years. Oh, she means the lectionary. Yeah, you get 2 hits at it once every 3 years. That's how it works. Sue says the image in my head of Paul bouncing around being ecstatic is very funny. It's not how I usually imagine him. I reckon there's a book to be written there, ecstatic, bounding around Paul. I don't know. It's probably got no scholarly basis whatsoever, but never mind.
Oh, that's Eddie Izzard.
Eddie.
Oh, now there's crushed velvet and high heels, and you just
painted nails.
Is now a good moment to leave Paul before we take him any more? We see Panto, Rachel. I'm blaming you. You're all Panto. See, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Genesis. Now there are actually different versions of the Old Testament reading you can have with the lectionary, but we've chosen to focus in these on what's called the continuous. So we are journeying through Genesis, the story of the patriarchs, the stories of how Israel comes to be. And this week, those little twins that we heard about last week, all grown up, and Jacob has a dream at Bethel, has the most uncomfortable night's sleep on a stone, as far as I'm concerned, and has this vision of heaven. Rachel, are you lifted to heaven when you read this text? Where do you go with it?
No, actually, really almost the opposite, almost deeply rooted in place in some ways. When I read this, there's something wonderful in that Jacob, we've been following this through. Jacob, who is deeply flawed, is still able to do God's will and is still able to be blessed. So that's kind of a starting point. But some really kind of physical stuff in this for me. In his dream, it says, and God stood beside him. There's this, now my translation of the Bible says ladder, but apparently it's more Led Zeppelin than that. It's a stairway. It's not a ladder, right? It's a stairway to heaven But God isn't up there at the end of the stairway. God is stood next to Jacob, talking to him about not just the blessings that he will receive, but actually the blessing he will be to other people. What God is giving to Jacob is that he and his offspring will be a blessing to the people in that land. It's the gift of being a gift. It's not, here's something for you to take away and keep for yourself. Here's something that will enable you to bless others in this place and wherever you go. There is both and, which for me this week, doing online and in church, wherever we might be, both and is quite helpful for that to crop up in the lectionary this week. And the thing about presence, when he wakes up and he's, stones my pillow, rocks my bed, and he wakes up and it says, and I love that he was afraid and he said how awesome it is that this is God's place. Even this ridiculous rubbish place where there was nothing, there was no comfort, and it turns out God was here anyway. And it turns out God's going to be wherever I go. And it turns out that God's there, whatever happens. And I think there are some people in my community for whom that sense of presence at the moment is still quite, everybody's off back down the shops, but I'm still isolated at home. And I think that's going to be really important for people to hear this weekend. So yeah, those are the things that struck me, guys. How about you?
Well, I wasn't quite with Led Zeppelin. I did read in my for lots of reasons I wasn't with Led Zeppelin. But is it a ziggurat? You know, the thing that goes around in a square.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a South American thing, that it's possibly more like that. And there is the going up and the coming down. Alison's looking. Helen's going, don't ask me. But if either of you want to chip in on this, where would you take this passage? What's it saying to you?
I think that thing about place that Rachel just said is really interesting. Finding God in a place, unexpectedly, but in a physical place. I think we've probably been talking a little bit more about place and where we meet God and worshipping in places that are not where we normally would. At the kitchen table with the laptop is not probably how most people have worshipped for the last 20, 30, 40 years. But for the last few weeks, for most of us, that's how it is. For some people, the ability to go into a church for individual prayer, or even in some places for Sunday worship with others. But again, so a particularly important place, but things still not how they were before. So a place, but a place that's different. And whenever I kind of come to the kind of stories of Jacob, I've still got in my head the bit that hasn't yet happened, but wrestling with. So here, Jacob has this place and it's God and it's amazing, but I know that it's just a couple of chapters, 4 chapters down the road, and he's wrestling again. And I find myself back to that messiness, and complexity all over again.
That's what we would call a spoiler if we were
sorry, yes,
a TV series.
Anyone who hasn't read further on in Genesis, I'm sorry.
But it is coming up in the lectionary. Helen, I wonder if you might reflect on that a little bit, because this place is interesting, and you're someone who often doesn't or isn't able to worship in your place.
Yeah. So I think I found what Rachel said really powerful, actually, about this dichotomy about people are rushing back to the shops, but actually there will be some people who aren't, and who are actually quite very, very scared. Perhaps they're still shielding, or perhaps they've been told they don't have to shield anymore, but they're still wanting to shield anyway. And it does feel quite scary out there, because for a lot of people, all of a sudden it's all gone right, we can all get back to normal now, and it's almost going from a standing start. And actually there are a lot of people at home actually going, well, a minute, I don't know how to be out in the world again at the moment, because everyone else has had a gradual reintegration. But for everyone who's been shielding, and then suddenly on the 1st of August or whenever it is, you can all just start going out again, it's quite scary. And for someone who lives with chronic illness, I've not been shielding actually, but I know a lot of people who have. The world is in lots of ways becoming more scary than it has been. And actually, I think, Alison, you just said about people not worshipping through a laptop and all the rest of it. For lots of us, that has been our life for the past, you know, I haven't been able to get through a whole church service for 5 years. And for many weeks, I've been more involved in my church than I've been in the last 5 years, because my church has come to me, because it's all gone online and suddenly it's accessible. And actually the concept of it, all this finishing, is actually quite lamentable for me, because actually suddenly the barriers are going to go up again, and there's going to be things that I can access and things that I can't access. Whereas for the last few months, I've been able to access just as much as everybody else. Whereas now, it's, you know, the thought of things going back again is actually quite scary. I've slightly lost my train of thought, because this isn't anything to do with the passage really. But yeah, I think pastorally, when we're preaching, it's important to recognize that people are in different places when we're talking about place and talking about things returning to normal or things changing. Actually, for some of us, we live that differently. And just so I guess it's just a pastoral note to be aware. Yeah, I think a slightly different vein, I got slightly stuck in this passage, and it could be just me focusing on a sentence that's just been mistranslated or isn't really that important. But I found it really interesting, the promise about Jacob's descendants being like dust of the earth. So we've gone from Abraham getting like the twinkly stars and the grains of sand, and it's all very lovely. Jacob's descendants get dust of the earth. Which is a bit of a come down, isn't it? But, and again, that might just be completely nothing to do with anything, but it does again speak to this rootedness, isn't it? Because it's not lofty at all. It's the opposite of lofty. It's very earthy. And again, if you think about, you know, we were made, you know, from dust. What's that? You know, all you guys who do funerals that I don't, you know,
earth,
you know, and about the creation narrative again. And I don't know, there's something that speaks to the rootedness and the place, doesn't it, as well? Yeah.
Thank you. That was beautiful, and I can hear the lovely Brian Cox, you know, reminding us, because aren't stars made out of dust or something, or I don't know. Something like that. I'm just in a moment I'm going to come to my guests and ask them how they might preach on Sunday if they're preaching these texts. I think Alison and Rachel actually are. Helen and I aren't, so we would imagine ourselves into it. But just a few other things from folks who've been joining in on this idea of place and the Genesis reading. That this ridiculous rubbish place can be a stairway to heaven is so powerful. Surely the Lord is in this place. I did not know it. I agree about the unexpected meeting, especially as we aren't allowed in churches at the moment. Rachel says about being open to encounters in weird locations, maybe uncomfortable ones, like where you have a rock for a pillow. Weird choice, Jacob, but you do you. I like that. I think it was a common thing in those days. And Sue says perhaps it is that the place is still rubbish. It doesn't get transformed yet, but that doesn't stop it being a stairway to heaven. That feels like a good place just to pause there, the comments. So we've wrestled with three very different passages. Maybe there's some link in the Church of England tradition that I'm in. You wouldn't necessarily have to preach them all. You might just focus on one, or you might be super clever and weave them all together. But Alison, has something birthed in your mind? Where might you be preaching on Sunday?
Yeah, I think I am still with some of the messiness. But I think also that, really struck by hearing Helen and Rachel and some of the, just doing this and hearing different perspectives, and just that conversation we were just having about, right now, today, and what we're living through is different for different people. So I think for me, there's something about the messiness, there's something about different perspectives on the same thing. And there's got to be something out of that Romans that's that kind of hope of what is to come, and the overwhelming grace of God for each one of us.
Sounds like a good sermon. Rachel, it's something you've got to record yours tomorrow, have you? You're right.
Yeah, I'll be recording my sermon tomorrow. It's a bit weird because we've had guest preachers. It's been really nice. The bishop did a guest preach, and one of my predecessors, who's the Dean of Winchester, did a guest preach. So what do you want, Rachel? 6 minutes. I cannot deliver my own sermon in 6 minutes. So it's always longer when it's me, even though I'm only doing 2 readings. We're not doing the Romans reading, which I can now say is because there's just far too much in there. But in the service, we've got the Genesis and the Matthew. I think for me, I've kept writing things down about God's generosity. And what Alison was just saying about the different places where people are, and God's generosity accommodating that, and there being something reassuring as we are in this constant place of constant transition, that with no end in sight. So yeah, some comfort in God's generosity wherever we are. I think taking in some of the things that everybody said this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And Helen, if you were preaching this Sunday, in your context, you'd give a longer preach than Rachel's 6 minutes. A vineyard sermon's a bit longer. But where would you go if you're working with this?
I think probably my heart is in the Matthew, in the gospel passage, and it's about that word brutiful, and about the messiness of life, and about God's will for us to flourish where we are. I think that's probably where I'd go with that. Possibly ask some questions about whose job it is to pull up the weeds. It would be the Matthew passage.
And I come have to ask myself the question, and I always think something different to how I started. Sort of 45 minutes ago. I think I would go with the Genesis text actually this week, and particularly, although as my church we're not going back to our church building, probably not, certainly not until August, and maybe not until September. But this idea of God meeting with us in different places, and encounters with God in different places, which would probably ricochet nicely as well with the Romans passage, the whole thing being an adopted child of God and an Abba Father, that there is that closeness. So I think that's the kind of sermon I would preach about, the presence and connectedness with God, I think. But I'm not. So that's lovely. So I'm going to listen to one of our curates preach, the Reverend Mark Carroll. So I shall send him the link if he wasn't listening live today, and he can do something completely different, because that is the beauty of the scriptures. We listen with open ears. We hear what the Spirit is saying us today. So I want to say a huge thank you to Rachel for bringing your Panto Northern charm, for Alison for your wisdom from the rural setting of glorious Leicestershire, for Helen for your perspectives and from bringing some real wisdom into our conversations today. And thank you to everyone for chipping in. And I hope whatever you're doing today, you will know that you are a child of God, and that you flourish as the wheat of the field.